Okay, so welcome everybody. Thanks for coming to the second seminar in this Contemporary Women's Writing and Medical Humanities seminar series. This seminar series is being run by myself and my colleague Ben in Paris. Much more exciting where I am, and it's also being the support of the Centre for Contemporary Women's Writing, or CCWW, at the Institute of Modern Languages Research in London. So the medical humanities describes an increasingly prevalent, diverse field which seeks to explore interdisciplinary dialogues and crossovers between the health sciences and the humanities. This field, for instance, tests what disciplines such as the literary and film studies, philosophy, history of medicine, ethics, and many more can offer our understanding of medicine and healthcare, and vice versa. So this postgraduate and early career research online seminar series seeks to explore how contemporary women's writing in particular, whether it's fiction, poetry, autobiography, life writing, philosophy, etc., visual arts, and how all of these different forms are currently engaging with issues such as illness, disease, healthcare, medical practice, and clinical institutions. So we started in September, 2 weeks ago with Ben and I, and we're continuing until March 2021 with fortnightly seminars, a break for Christmas and New Year, and it's always on Tuesday evenings at 5:30 p.m. BST, so UK time, until roughly 7 p.m. You can register for the seminars via the IMLR, and we'll put the link in the chat, so that's always there every time you come. The link for the next seminar will be in the chat. So now for some Zoom house rules. So the session is being recorded, so it can be uploaded to the IMLR website. Please feel free to turn your cameras off, on, whichever you feel is most comfortable. But please keep your microphones muted throughout the entire seminar, and the entire seminar. And if you ever or later in the Q&A, if you can type your questions in the chat. We encourage as well, you can type them as the speakers are speaking, that's okay, and then as soon as you have an idea, put it in the chat, and then we can say them out loud for you, or you can do the kind of thumbs up wave hand emoji type thing on Zoom, and you can unmute yourself and say your question out loud yourself if you'd like as well. So how things will be running, we're going to have 2 15-minute papers, and then the Q&A session, and yeah, that's about it. I think that's my spiel done. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ben, who's going to be introducing the theme for this seminar and the 2 speakers.
Thank you very much, Becky. So thank you first to everyone for coming to this seminar. So the theme of this seminar is Feminizing Illness and Medicine, Narrative Methods, Forms and Aesthetics. And we're very lucky to have Marie Allitt and Diana-Andreea Novacino with us here today. And I think we'll kick off with Marie straight away. So Dr. Marie Allitt is Humanities and Healthcare Fellow at the University of Oxford on the project Advancing Medical Professionalism, Integrating Humanities Teaching in the University of Oxford's Medical School. She is also the postdoctoral research assistant for the Northern Network for Medical Humanities Research at the University of Leeds. Marie completed her PhD in English literature at the University of York in 2018, focusing on experiences and representations of spaces and senses in the First World War, medical caregiving narratives. Her research focuses on medical life writing, practitioner health, senses and medical spaces, architectures, and environments. And her paper today is called Containers, Cuts and Chronotopes, Writing Time and Space in Women's Pathographies. So thank you very much, Marie.
Great, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Great, and hopefully you can see my PowerPoint as well. Thank you very much to Ben and Becky for organising this series and for including me in it. The programme is fantastic and I'm thrilled to be a part of it. So today I'm going to be talking about some narrative techniques in relation to temporality and spatiality of illness, trauma and chronic pain, focusing primarily on 2 recently published works. I'm mainly going to be talking about Jen Ashworth's Notes Made While Falling, published in 2019, and I'm also going to briefly talk about Abby Palmer's Sanatorium, published in 2020. For those unfamiliar with Ashworth's book, it is a collection of interwoven essays addressing postpartum PTSD, childhood trauma with suggestions of abuse and neglect, her Mormon upbringing, as well as cultural and literary criticism and musings on writing sickness and trauma from a range of contexts. An established novelist and lecturer in creative writing, Ashworth immediately gets to the heart of this work, how to begin, how to write these experiences. She admits that her familiar form of fiction and the novel is not a suitable home for it. She admits, "I have lost my faith in fiction, which was supposed to be able to hold and transform everything. I am writing a novel, but I'm typing through a lump in my throat because I can't make a story about the most important thing I have to tell. What if the silence spreads, and in the end, I end up not being able to write fiction at all? Plot becomes a logic machine that creaks under the weight of the inexplicable thing that has happened, and I cannot make it acknowledge the way I need to live my life now." We can see here the theme that runs throughout the book, the relationship and articulation of the past, the things that have happened, and the way to live now. Ashworth reluctantly abandons a fictional retelling and attempts the memoir, but she does so in ways which continuously highlight the difficulties, imperfections, pitfalls of writing one's trauma, pain, and suffering, and questions how a book, fiction or none, can contain such big experiences. I'll be outlining a few of the techniques she uses, but I want to start with the issue of the temporal split as it relates to telling one's life story and the experience of trauma as something with delay. The act of life writing demands plurality which seems edged with a split. A central challenge of life writing is articulating events and one's own experiences of those events. There are necessarily two selves at play, the self as subject and the self as object. As Susanna Egan explains, autobiographers have always wrestled with the split between subject and object, between writing and written selves, seeing the very act of autobiography as present reflection upon the past. Arguably, this is intensified when we consider the concept of the self in relation to trauma, with the immediate association of a split psyche. Perhaps it is not entirely helpful to consider the individual's psychological state as splitting and thus as dividing, or at least we should define this more clearly. We could instead consider, in line with Nancy K. Miller, that it is as much about doubling out as split within. Plurality as doubling, especially along temporal and spatial lines, is central to Ashworth's text. In the first chapter or essay, How to Begin, The Cut, Ashworth wrestles with tenses and a means of writing what happened then and what is happening as she writes it. This is epitomised in her statement, a present tense moment that will expand into the years that haven't happened yet. She is inspired by and borrows the phrase, the present tense of its immediate aftermath. Tense and the switching or blurring of tenses and times is key to her approach and upsets the chronotope. The whole of this first chapter grapples with the question of how to start, which is also the question of where and when to begin. We can immediately identify these features in the opening of the whole book. A beginning is a cut in the onward flow of things. It is a lie too. We section out the story, slashing away what came before and after. A cut can form an opening, a hole or a door or a cave or a mine. But what kind of mine do we open? A landmine? Yes, a bomb. Knowing already that this is the wrong place to start, we will begin with the operating table and me upon it, abdomen gaping. The sound I hear is my blood hitting the floor. I have been operated on once already today, in the recovery room. After the first incision was sutured closed, I started to hemorrhage. The epidural left me too numb to feel the wetness of the blood on my legs, and I didn't notice it. What on the surface may not seem like an especially experimental or unusual way of presenting unease with expression, Ashworth repeatedly uses the forward slash. Here are some examples of that. I was falling, I still am. I am sitting here typing. I am in the literature tent at a Christian music and arts festival. Ashworth is in two places at once, the past and the present, at one stage of her writing and another stage of her writing, at a different time and in a different place. It punctuates the geography of the page by puncturing, piercing the spatial and temporal synthesis expected of narrative. A powerful example reflects back on that hemorrhage and operation. I was the only one in the room who didn't see my blood. I heard it running off the end of the operating table, splashing onto the floor. I smelled it. I smell it all the time. But I didn't see it and wasn't allowed to see the hole until it was stapled and sutured into modesty. Everyone else saw it except for me, but I wasn't there. I was there. The restless placelessness that the slash invokes not only represents the temporal and spatial split, it also gives room for the existential, as this last line demonstrates. In the background of these concerns for writing effectively is the question of truth and authenticity, which brings me to a poem by Emily Dickinson, which Ashworth briefly alludes to in her book, but does not explicitly address. It's the first line of this poem that is most important. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. And this is what I keep coming back to when I think about the slash. Dickinson is renowned for her interesting use of punctuation in her poetry, but also for the editorial interference of multiple compilers of her work over the years. Examples of her punctuation choices have therefore become especially important points of scholarship. Presence is just as significant as their absence. I want to suggest 3 ways we might read Ashworth's use of the forward slash. Firstly, can the slant of the slash be considered a form of dash in a similar mode to Emily Dickinson? In her article, Hinged Pictures, the Material Poetics of Punctuation, writing in relation to that same Dickinson poem, Julie Phillips Brown outlines how the 1844 Webster definition for dash encompasses not only the mark or line in writing or printing, noting a break or stop in the sentence, and a pause or the division of the sentence, but also collision, infusion, admixture, a rushing, a sudden stroke, and a flourish. Thus, the dash is a paradoxical mark that both divides, break or stop, and joins collision and admixture. The dash moves forward in a line with speed and rushing, but it also lingers, a pause. The punctuation both splits and connects. It determines when the clauses are connected or separate. It instructs on cause and effect, linearity and progression. It draws 2 opposing things together or splits them apart. It makes 2 thoughts, 2 actions, 2 timestamps possible. The second way that we might read this. What if we think of the slash as a door left ajar or crooked on its hinges? Here I turn to George Perec to help think this through. We protect ourselves, we barricade ourselves in. Doors stop and separate. The door breaks space in 2, splits it, prevents osmosis, imposes a partition. On one side, me in my place, the private, the domestic. On the other side, other people, the world, the public, politics. You can't simply let yourself slide from one into the other, can't pass from one to the other, neither in one direction nor in the other. You have to have the password, have to cross the threshold, have to show your credentials, have to communicate. Helpfully, Perec outlines the breaking and splitting of a space that places different things on either side of the door. It is hinged. With Ashworth, however, she does not confine the reader to the interior or the exterior. She welcomes, requires, maybe even demands that the reader come and go, cross the threshold for better orientation and understanding of her world. Keys are not required, porosity rather than a barrier. The third way we might read this. What if we take the slash at its onomatopoeic word? A cut, a slice, a division. Perhaps that line represents a knife or scalpel, a nick in the paper that slices through time and makes subsequent sheets of paper visible. Time prevents me from sharing further examples of the slash, so I will move on to another interesting example, which concerns containers. Ashworth's 4th essay or chapter, entitled Ground Zero, is heavily focused on the container and containment in both its content and its form. It takes the form of a Russian doll or nesting doll effect, which I have tried to illustrate here. The chapter is split into 9 sections numbered from 8 to 0. We have the beginning of 8, then it stops. We have the beginning of 7, then it stops, and so on. When you come to 0, it is a whole section, and then we get the second part of 1, the second part of 2, etc. The outer dolls specifically focus on Chernobyl, commencing from Ashworth's fascination with watching a video of the second shelter being erected over the old power station, which becomes itself a nest of shelters over time. The end of each section stops abruptly. It is an aposiopesis. I've tried to show this here. So on the left-hand side are the final lines of the first half of the section, and on the right-hand side is the first line of the second part of the section. So as a reader, how do you encounter this? A decision is handed over to the reader. Do you read it as laid out on the page in a fractured and fragmented form, or do you flip the pages back and forth to find some cohesion? This returns us to the image of the hinge. The book's spine becomes the hinge which the reader moves. Another challenge to the chronological flow can be seen in Abby Palmer's Sanatorium, which is an account of living with chronic illness and pain. It concerns a trip to thermal baths in Budapest, her subsequent decision to buy a special bathtub for home, and flicks back and forth into earlier and concomitant and later periods of her illness. Palmer emphasises that chronicity is never linear. By switching locations and disrupting the chronology of events, she moves the reader across time stamps of places, cities, and countries. Arguably, Palmer's whole text is about containers. It concerns bathtubs and swimming pools and therapeutic baths. It is about containment and how the water, hydrotherapy, can hold the body in a way that takes some of the pressure off. Immersing myself in bodies of water is just one of many techniques I have experimented with to ease my chronic pain. I don't know why floating leads to visions. I think it is something to do with amniotic fluid. Palmer plays with the reader by disrupting chronology. Using single pages to articulate specific details or episodes, Palmer moves us geographically and temporally. Most of Palmer's pages may not suggest a radical presentation or form by just looking at it. It's the paratextual header of each page on the right that orientates us, as these images are trying to show. As we read, we learn and continually reorientate ourselves to the time or place to which we have moved. London becomes a specific part of her life, living with friends and later her boyfriend. Budapest, we quickly learn, is her time at the thermal baths. Chertsey is one of the places she lived with family years earlier. And here's another example of that. Not every page contains these references, however. And here's an example. There are sections that are placeless and timeless if we follow the label logic. These take on a more ethereal form. They feel submerged, poetic, fractional, impressionistic, hovering or floating, dreamlike and hallucinatory. At the end of the book, but not the chronological end, Palmer writes, "The physiotherapist invites me to warm up. We take small, deliberate steps across the water. She explains that the power of hydrotherapy is that the water supports your body weight so you don't have to. Everything feels very familiar. I wonder if what I've learned about chronic illness, more than anything, is that it's a constant cycle. You fall apart, then you try your best to rebuild again. I wonder what would happen if I stopped trying. She asks me to climb up and down the steps and suggests that I tell her when I've done enough. You know your body best, she says, and I nod in agreement. I am beginning again." For some writers, this might be their starting place. For Palmer, it is an end point, but an end point that feels on the edge of a curve, taking you back round to the beginning. A reader could go back to the start, read it again, and experience the different times and places differently or repetitiously. And this would represent the circularity, the chronicity of the experience of chronic illness and chronic pain. This is reinforced when we refer to Sarah Wasson's argument that when reading narratives of chronic pain, we need to notice and unsettle the assumption that the act of reading must incur an orientation towards teleogenesis, an assumption about how a textual passage is oriented towards a particular unfurling in imagined future time. Palmer's text in particular reminds us this. The story does not reach a conclusion, culminate, it continues. As I make my way towards the conclusion of this paper, I want to come full circle and return to the idea of trauma. Part of the reason that Ashworth's text in particular has struck such a chord with me is how it echoes and clarifies much of my earlier thinking about trauma and writing. Do we have a tendency to underestimate the significance of the spatial when it comes to trauma? Temporality dominates in the words repression, return, repetition. What if we took the spatial first and then the temporal as a two-step process of reading? For me, this resonates with an aspect of trauma theory from Cathy Carruth. The history that a flashback tells is a history that literally has no place, neither in the past, in which it was not fully experienced, nor in the present, in which its precise images and enactments are not fully understood. Carruth foregrounds the temporal dislocation not only between experience and flashback, but also between experience and its retrospective retelling. However, the detail of no place warrants further attention. The experience resides outside of time, or rather in multiple times. To say that it has no place, therefore, is to suggest it actually exists in multiple spaces and places. I found something resonant in Ashworth's work, and I'd like to leave the last word with her. Woolf knew that trauma is a strobe, that it is always both repetition and variation. It is both track and breach and fake and real. And if trauma had a time and a place, then it would be the no time, no place utopia of the eternal present tense, the sheer icy surface of now, the cold obliteration of forever, this page, this keyboard, this bed. Thank you for listening. And I would just try and hand back to you, Becky.
Okay.
1 second.
No, thank you very much for that, Marie. That was great.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Marie. That was so fascinating. I've got a list of questions here that I want to ask. So I think we'll go straight on to Diana-Andreea.
Sorry, 1 second. I'm just trying to make this work. Oh, I know why. It's because I haven't stopped sharing. Sorry.
Okay. Right, Ben, you go. Your turn.
Okay, so next we have Diana-Andreea Novacino. So Diana-Andreea Novacino is a cultural studies PhD student at the University of Bucharest. Her doctoral dissertation, Clinical Encounters, the Medical Imaginary in Contemporary Visual Arts, examines how the Foucauldian medical gaze is reflected in present-day medical-inspired imagery. Diana holds an MA in Image Theory and Practice from the Centre of Excellence in Image Studies. Parallel to her academic career, she has been completing her residency in epidemiology and hygiene. Diana is a contributing writer for the US-based Synapsis, a health humanities journal, as well as an independent curator. Thank you very much, Diana. I'll hand over to you. Oh, sorry. And Diana's paper is called A World of One's Own, Women's Depictions of Clinical Spaces in Contemporary Visual Arts. Thank you very much, Diana.
Thank you. Just a moment, I'm having a bit of trouble with the presentation. Rebecca, if you can help me, please.
Yeah. So if you like hover over the bottom part of the screen, it should say share screen. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then a window pops up, and then you can pick which window you want to show us. So if you have your document,
it doesn't
PowerPoint.
appear here. I sent it to you in email a bit earlier.
So you share it on your computer. So if you have it open, yeah.
Just 1 second, please. I just don't know what's happening. Okay, so I have the whiteboard, the iPad. Okay, just 1 second. I will open it again on my computer, and hopefully it will only take a minute for it to appear. Finally, okay. So, are you seeing it? Okay, so my presentation is titled A Word of One's Own, a sort of a small pun, Women's Depictions of Clinical Spaces in Contemporary Visual Arts. I would like to start with the following question. How do we define clinical spaces? How do image and text juxtapose and intersect in defining them in works of visual arts? My main research directions for these brief presentations are the following. I will first present how visual artists integrate their perspective as a patient. Secondly, I will approach how visual artists work inside the clinic. They do shadowing, hospital residencies, and maybe even undertake clinical procedures and then use that experience and those images in their works. The third category is of artists who depict and write the clinical from other positions, such as carers. It may be a one-time interest in their career, for example. The fourth category is that of medical practitioners who are amateur artists and writers, and as I will further present, they may be not exactly forced, but they may be aided by certain factors to undertake this artistic endeavor. And the final category is that of the anonymous or unknown woman who is leaving her graphic and textual mark on the clinic. The first category is represented by the British artist, Jo Spence, who is a well-known photographer. She created several series during the 70s and 80s who had markedly social content. And in 1982, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And she worked simultaneously both on several series of photographs and on an autobiography and a number of essays. This picture is from the series, a picture of hers, and is titled, How Do I Begin? You see the artist depicted in a stark background, a very clinical white background, wearing only a sheet and having an X marked over her breast. And from her autobiography, we learn that while she was in hospital awaiting her diagnosis, one morning, whilst reading, I was confronted by the awesome reality of a white, young white-coated doctor with student retinue standing by my bedside. As he referred to his notes without introduction, he bent over me and began to ink a cross onto the area of flesh above my left breast. As he did so, a whole chaotic series of images flashed through my head. Rather like drowning, I heard this doctor, whom I had never met before, this potential daylight mugger, tell me that my left breast would have to be removed. Equally, I heard myself answer, no, incredulously, rebelliously, suddenly, angrily, attackingly, pathetically, alone, in total ignorance. I realized with horror that my body was not made of photographic paper, nor was it an image or an idea or a psychic structure. It was made of blood, of bones and tissue. Some of them appeared to be cancerous, and I didn't even know where my liver was located. She further details, this particular disjuncture in my knowledge of the physical world caused such a crisis in my thinking and activity that it is only now, some 6 months later, that I am beginning to realize what has happened to me. So began a research project on the politics of cancer, with a fervent desire to understand how I could begin to have a different approach to health in which there would be less consumerism, more medical accountability, more social responsibility, and more self-responsibility. Another picture from the series is this one, entitled Property of Jo Spence, in which the artist wrote the phrase over her breast. Basically, when it comes to Spence's use of text in photographs, I would consider them to be narrative fragments. That is, the artist uses them not just to construct her own cancer story, but to construct a grander narrative of class, of gender, of aging, of disability, which were all subjects that she approached in her work and in her larger political socialist framework. What I would also like to say is that for Spence, there is no central representation of breast cancer, or later on as leukemia, as following her breast cancer diagnosis, she had a period of well health, and then she was diagnosed with leukemia in the early 90s. But instead, cancer, just like the clinical encounters and the clinical environment, are multifaceted. There is no one narrative because each experience in itself is unique. And this juxtaposition is perhaps best evident in her use of both private and clinical spaces. So here we see the artist in her home. She is framing the injured breast, the cancerous breast. She's wearing a necklace, a symbol of femininity. Her political credo is shown by that poster, which is in the foreground of the room. But in this picture, which is the title, is not a question. The breast is a property of Joe Spence. The breast is not a property of the medical establishment. Another series was Cancer Shock, which is basically a photo novel in which she combined texts from magazines, from medical books, and text of her own into these collage compositions, which question how cancer and how cancer treatment were presented to women, how they were presented in British society in the early 80s. And one of the laminated panels in this series reads, "I returned to the hospital to the definitive confirmation that my tumor was cancerous. The duty nurse was very supportive, and I felt genuinely upset that part of my job was first to give me the bad news, then to have to tell me the hospital could not offer any immediate in-house counseling because of the cuts. An appointment could be made," she said, "but there was a waiting list. In the meantime, my doctor could prescribe some medication. I said no, I would make my own private arrangements, and left feeling utterly alone. In the shadows of my fears came also a rebellion against the rubbish I discovered that I was being fed about my treatment options and the need to have my whole breast off. Thus ended my first lesson as a cancer patient." She didn't have a good experience with the traditional clinical process. So for her, passing through the hands of the medical orthodoxy was terrifying. And she became determined to document every step of the process, not to be merely the object of their medical discourse, but to be the active subject of her own investigation. And in another photograph, she convinced the radiographer to take a portrait of her whilst undergoing that investigation. So basically, she was deflecting the medical gaze and asserting her own artistic gaze and integrating the medical practitioner into her artistic praxis. Other pictures of the series are taken in hospitals, like this one, where we see a retinue of possibly medical students doing their visits. And on the photograph on the right, we see a staging she did as a part of an artistic therapeutical process in which she recreated traumatic incidents from her life, from before her illness, and from the time she spent inside the medical establishment. This is another picture from the series in which she expresses how she felt infantilized in the medical environment. Of course, there were other pictures taken in between. Here is a collage I made of them. She tried the various alternative medical practices. And after she was diagnosed with leukemia, she created the final project, like you see this picture of her standing in front of the grave, in which she explored her own mortality. And she continued to take self-portraits like this one, which was taken in hospice until very close to her death. And finally, to end the Joe Spence subchapter, asked about the meaning of her works, she said, "I think we should try to represent a struggle for becoming well and not just throw up a new breed of victims and heroines. The work should be about the fact that most adult women, for most of the time, are in control of doctors for one reason or another, and may never experience good health when they start to have children. Our photographic work should show women trying to have more control over their bodies, as part of women's struggles generally to have more control. I want to pass on what I have learned to my nieces, so that if they are unfortunate enough to be chronically ill, and they will not see it as only natural, but to be able to ask questions and perhaps change the course of their lives with new knowledge about, for instance, how to confront doctors, which is something almost impossible for most of us, because ideologically speaking, they are seen as authorities figure and surrogate daddies. So in Spence's work, the juxtaposition of text and image underlines these authorities. She challenges it and asserts her own will as an artist and as a patient. Now, the use of medical documents, of medical text in clinical artwork has a tradition in modern art, for example, and in contemporary art, for example, in Carol Jerem's, an Australian photographer's Royal Hobart Hospital series, which the artist did where she was diagnosed with a terminal disease in 1979. She was around 30. She took snapshots of the doctors during the rounds of the nurses of her daily life in the clinic, but she also took snapshots of her medical documents, such as this medical certificate. Another important use of text in contemporary work is basically as a means to an end and as a way to further interpret and to further analyze artwork. For example, in Novaceanu, Angers from 1994, the artist detailed in various interviews how it took her 7 or 8 years of asking doctors to do this invasive procedure, which wasn't a medical necessity. And in the end, it was only possible with huge review of ethics and a lot of documents that were being signed on both sides. And this idea of medical vulnerability, of the ability to use your own body image, to use your own interior of the body in artistic praxis, which can be done only through the clinical environment, puts into question what place do medical consent forms, lab results, doctor's notes, internal communications occupy in artistic creation, and how may they best be contextualized and interpreted? Would the use of literary concepts such as paratext or hypertext, if we bend and extend their meaning to clinical writing, be best used to frame the women's artistic responses? Another example is that of Russian artist Taisia Korkova, who did a reproduction series in 2010. Now, for those who do not know her, she won the prestigious Kandinsky Prize in 2010, and she is an artist who combines the socialist realist tradition with a post-human approach. She visits factories and laboratories and clinics and details the scientific project in her works. And in the reproduction series, she concentrates on what she says are babies, are medical practitioners and students and mothers. And so each is in its own a category. Now, what is interesting about the Korkova's work, she doesn't use text. She doesn't use text in her paintings, but her paintings have been generative for discussion in the online environment because they touch upon the experience of many women. And such work is very important when considering digital research. And how can paratext in the form of comments, in the form of forums and other means like that be used in further interpreting an art series and its purpose? Because she interacts with her followers, with her fans, and together they basically weave online narratives about reproduction, about infertility, about so many aspects of a woman's life, which are not still so out in the open. When it comes to artists with an interest in the clinic, for one installation, for example, Eva Kotatova from the Czech Republic did this installation in 2015, the two-headed biographer and the Museum of Notions at the Bochnice Psychiatric Hospital in Prague. Now that is a former psychiatric institution which now functions as an independent art space. This installation contained multiple works. It contained performances. It contained sculptures. It was going on all throughout the institution and its yard. And what I want to say briefly is that the artist took inspiration from the condition of the psychiatric patient as a creator, as an artist who maybe never managed to actually put those creations in the real life, but he had those ideas, and she used for inspiration text and images which were created by former psychiatric patients of that hospital. And in this part of the installation, for example, we see a lot of pages from magazines, we see pictures, we see text, and these are based on the story of a patient who would try and assemble his own magazine, and he would cut letters and he would cut images and assemble them again and again, but in the end he never managed to have a solid copy of his work. He never managed to put his idea into actual practice. Okay, like I said, it had various installations. Now, Sophie Wallen is a Welsh artist, and with this installation, This Too Shall Pass, from 2011, she was nominated by the British Women Artists Association. The work is a response to a period of her life when her children were hospitalized for long periods of time. And she basically considered This Too Shall Surpass as her personal mantra, which she embroidered again and again on a hospital blanket. This work made her pass over this incident in her biography. Again, she uses an old psychiatric hospital bed, and the threads are connected to skeins of red wool situated in a sewing box. So basically, we have this passing from text to the pure materiality of the artwork. So just so I go a bit faster, when it comes to medical creators, to physicians who are engaged in the arts, Liu Shizfen is such an example. She is a nurse from Taiwan. She debuted at the Taipei Biennale in 1998. And in installations such as this, A Manifold Debate of Fuses Between Membrane and Skin, she uses clinical text in the form of pages from medical books and other clinical paraphernalia. Another example is that of Gemma Wilson, which created this work, Hospital Gown, in 2015. She is a midwife who has also undergone training in the medical humanities. And this piece was inspired by the symbolic power of the white coat, and is embroidered with words she considered are important in this dialogue between the wearer of the clinical white coat, doctor, and the wearer of the patient coat, like sufferer and powerless. And she uses this juxtaposition of text over image in a lot of her works. Okay, and finally, I would like to say a few words about the gendered perception of urban and street art and how this relates to the clinical environment. So generally, when we talk about street art, we assume that it is made by male artists. And as Nancy MacDonald remarks, the female writer's task is a difficult one. Male writers work to prove they are men, but female writers must work to prove they are not women, writer in the context of graffiti writer. And Vittoria Parisi further asserts that women's recognition as urban artists seems to be bound to a certain idea of feminine aesthetics, not just a misconception of what femininity is, but rather on a misconception of what art is. And one such example is this one. This is graffiti from the maternity hospital walls of a maternity hospital in Volgograd Oblast in the Russian Federation. And what is very interesting, that translated, these are messages of thanks. Thank you for the daughter. Thank you for the child. And they're usually addressed to the mother. However, when speaking with a graffiti researcher, we came to the agreement that it would be very hard to say that their creators are actually males. They may be an aunt, they may be someone else from that woman's family, because we don't know their cultural significance for that particular region. We don't know their cultural significance for the people of that social background who create such works. So a lot more research needs to be done in order to actually see who makes such works and if they indeed represent some women's texts. Another example is that of the San Giovanni Bosco General Hospital in Turin, where an intervention was held by an arts foundation. So very, very, very briefly, the doctors and nurses there rejected using widely used measures such as posters and reproductions and interventions by art students. And considering that hospital words have an intrinsic potential capability of communication, they decided to start this project, Medical Graffiti, and staff was involved all throughout it. It was non-hierarchical, and basically each doctor and nurse who participated decided on a phrase, and they used the stickers to put it in a continuous line on the wall. So there would be no hierarchy, like in the medical establishment. This had a positive response from the patients and visitors, who considered that it reinforced trust and it gave them a brief glance into the humanity of the local medical personnel. Now, this hospital is doing many more other arts initiatives, like creating these luminaries. And during the COVID pandemic in April, they recreated something similar. So it was Michaela Kirvallo, which is a medical emergency physician from that hospital, said one day she came to work and a wall had been set up to separate the area where COVID patients were treated. And because people could not recognize themselves easily, they began to do small writings on the walls, pep talk and funny sayings and just signatures and anything like that. And she says, in just over a week, that wall, which has become a symbol of our struggle, was filled with signatures and graffiti. It reminds us that we are united, even if we cannot touch, and to recognize each other, we have to talk to each other, because the only thing that comes out of the uniforms are the eyes. We are already talking about when we will tear down that wall. What will do? Who will do the hammering? Who will do the punching? Who will direct? When we deflate the tent and we can hug. So again, we have this combination of the materiality of the wall and the metaphorical meanings of the text. And the final slides are about a hospital in Wuhan, where again, during their precious spare moments, the physicians and nurses there, they made drawings, which also included text. So for example, this one reads, "I wish the mountains and the rivers are unharmed, that the human world is safe." This one has an enumeration of the local hospitals where COVID patients were treated, and it details they wear white uniforms, give up personal safety to guard other people. And the last one, which is perhaps the most potent, is a poem written on the 25th of February. This follows the Asian poetry style of Songqi and various patterns from traditional Chinese writing. And the text says, "The COVID-19 pandemic is raging. The motherland is crying, combating the virus. Soldiers in white uniforms are strong, health-related, life entrusted, fearless, farewell to love and fear. They are eager to go to the battlefield. They travel thousands of miles for the country. Do not go back without defeating the enemy. Until the brutal virus is defeated, it will bring joy." So a poem such as this would be a presentation's worth of traditional Chinese motifs, of Chinese propaganda and everything like that in itself. Finally, arriving to conclusion, I would like to say that adding text to an image creates another dimension to the artwork and may emphasize the perceived message or assert a questioning or even contradictory viewpoint. Unaltered clinical text is in itself a powerful tool that women artists use to deconstruct conventional narratives of the medical establishment. There are several research directions in need of further research at the site-specific, local, regional, national, and international level. Creations of physicians and other medical practitioners are important reminders of the importance of a visual medical humanities pathway. And finally, urban and street art forms are currently undergoing a change of discourse disregarding previous gendered approaches. Ethnographic and anthropological studies of hospital works may add valuable insight for public health and educational outreach. Sorry, I was so emotional, and thank you all for listening. And now I have to make you.
Thanks so much for that, Diana. That was absolutely brilliant. And I've got another huge list of questions that I want to ask you about it.
Of course. I'm trying to add Rebecca as a presenter again.
So yeah, everyone remember that you can either write your questions in the group chat and then I will read them out for you, or Becky will read them out, or you can also choose to read them out if you wish yourself. Or you can use the raise hand function on Zoom. So either of those are possibilities. So we already have a question. So I'll just read this out. It's from Catherine. So Catherine says, thank you both for your interesting presentations. My question is for Marie. I was struck by the comparison made by the second writer between the hydrotherapy and the comfort given by the uterus. From the extracts you gave, it appears that the trauma experienced by the first writer was her experience of a C-section. Does she address how maternity relates to her personal experience of trauma? Is maternity a form of illness for her?
Thank you. That's a really great question. There's certainly throughout Ashworth's text, and she comes back to this moment when she's on the operating table, and the trauma that comes from that, and it's there all the way through her text. What is interesting is, she doesn't actually really write about her children. She's got 2 children, and this is from her second labour. She doesn't write about her children that much, but kind of all the way through, there are these hints at, feeling like she's not a very good mother. And this is also connected with her own trauma from childhood, which is never explicitly clear, so we can only really assume. But it does seem that her parents split up. Her father was possibly abusive. She talks about her mother, but not in great terms. So I think there's probably this added element of concern for repeating patterns, which is such a long thought issue about repeating your mother's mistakes or something like that. But what actually that your question really made me think about motherhood and maternity in terms of the Russian doll, which I hadn't quite appreciated, and the idea of bodies inside bodies and holding bodies, containing bodies, and how to think about the Russian doll and nesting dolls in terms of motherhood and maternity is like another level that I'd quite like to explore, I think. Hopefully that answers the question. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. So if I'm going to leave everyone to kind of keep putting their questions on the group chat. In the meantime, I had a question that I think could relate to both papers. So I was really interested in Diana's talk. You were talking about this like a brilliant photography that like reverses the medical gaze, and there were these photographs that were looking at the medical team as they were consulting someone else in a bed, and the gaze like looking up at them rather than them looking down. And I just wondered, how do you think that these practices of kind of like reversing the medical gaze, could they be kind of like, how could they be put into actual kind of clinical practice on a day-to-day basis in hospitals? Is there a way in which kind of patients could be given the chance to reverse the gaze kind of constantly, like in their medical treatment? And also, how does this experience of reversing the medical gaze, how does that kind of affect your own research, or your own research in epidemiology and your own kind of clinical, the clinical work that you're doing as well in hygiene and etc. And then I was wondering how that might relate to the spatial questions that were coming up in Marie's talk as well. You were talking about how trauma is always seen as a kind of temporal thing, and that you were kind of gesturing towards the more spatial kind of things about the spatial conceptions of trauma. So I was also wondering how you think, how could those also be kind of made into kind of physical spaces of physical clinical spaces, and how kind of spatial therapies could be developed, maybe. Sorry, that's a very big question. So basically this kind of spatial element in both of the talks, and how this could be kind of translated into practice.
So I think that first of all, it's a very good question. I think it has great potential for practical achievements in medical humanities education, in medical school educations. I would take the theater of the object as an example, and the recent initiatives in decolonializing theater, and just the relationship between oppressor and those oppressed. Because if you go to its most germinal state, basically patients like Joe Spence, artist patients, they feel not only violated by the medical gaze, but they feel profoundly oppressed by it. And they decide to turn that gaze to the medical establishment, not the doctor as a person, because Spence, for example, was good friends with a number of doctors, but to the medical establishment, because they perceive it as an authoritarian regime. For Spence, she decided to do her own research into operations for breast cancer, and she insisted on a lumpectomy. And she was right, because 30 years later now, we do lumpectomies for her sort of cancer. But she did this on her own, and she had to convince the oncologist from a London hospital that this was the way to go. So in a way, it's not an impartial game with no investment. The artists who are creating such artworks are extremely invested in the clinical process. They may spend years reading on scientific methods, on therapies, and at the same time on ways in which they can put their ideas into practice. So, for example, Spence did that series Phototherapy, which has a vast phenomenological and philosophical background. Yeah, so I think it's definitely possible to do a series of ateliers, to do a series of workshops for students in which they are forced to turn that look upon themselves. And when it comes to me, I think it's a very difficult question to answer, because I have always been passionate about art, and I was writing an essay a bit earlier how I was always rushing from my clinical rotations to art openings and the like. This moment in which I started judging myself came rather early. So for me, it came in my student days, whilst I was perfecting my medical gaze. I one day came upon the works of Robert Mapplethorpe and upon one of his final self-portraits. And I think then it clicked to me how important it is the way a person self-represents himself, and how important it is to give patients their own power, not just in representing themselves, but in as many decisions as possible. Of course, we cannot change the clinical establishment in its entirety, but there are a lot of aspects referring to consent, referring to general treatment, referring to bedside manner, which can be improved and must be improved, and that the medical humanities and the health humanities are one of the best ways to do this right now.
So yeah, thanks for the question, Ben. For me, in my broader research, the attention to the space is kind of central, both in terms of how it's written, but also in how in terms of how it's experienced as well. So thinking about the spatial aspects that I was talking about today, in terms of a kind of real world, how it's in treatment, practice, physical, it's a reminder for the importance of the whole body in the experience, and in the memory of those experiences. It's also a reminder that the clinical spaces will have significant effect long after the person is discharged from hospital, for example. So the patient's medical experience, the positive and the negative and everything in between, it's never just about the procedure that they've had or the various medical practitioners that they've encountered. It's not just about the instruments used upon them. It's the whole space, and it's moving through those different spaces. It's experiencing the waiting room, it's experiencing the hospital corridors, it's experiencing treatment rooms. The Ashworth example is really interesting because she talks about the operating theatre, and it's quite rare that a patient remembers or has an experience of inside the operating theatre, because usually people are unconscious, although more and more now people are able to have various procedures awake. So it's a reminder to think about all the spaces, and that's why the aesthetics are so important. And it's also important about the smells and the sounds that surround those experiences and how those will impact the memory and the potential trauma that comes from that as well.
Thanks so much for both of your answers. That's absolutely fascinating. We've had a few more questions in the group chat during that time. So we've got one from Chris, who says, "Thank you both. These were very interesting talks. My question is for you both. I was wondering if you see this as connected to Sontag's geographies of pain, her idea of 2 passports and 2 districts, but connected realms. You both talk about it, but I was wondering if you see this actualized in the specific work that you do."
For me, it certainly is, because, for example, for Spence again, she did not have like a continent of pain, the breast cancer. She had her own atlas of experiences. And once she was diagnosed with leukemia, she found that all her visual aids, all her visual strategies she used in depicting and in coming to terms with her original illness could not be used, because in her words, leukemia could not be represented. It's an invisible illness. It's an illness which has very few cultural, iconic associations. And she found that none of her strategies from breast cancer could be used to leukemia. So she had to construct a new geography, and because she knew she was basically on borrowed time, she focused on that final series, which goes beyond the illness itself and approaches basically mortality and her coming to terms with her passing.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Chris. Yeah, it's certainly relevant. I think what is interesting with these texts I talked about in my argument, this idea of it not really ending, in comparison to something like cancer or certain illnesses where there might be this journey from diagnosis, treatment, and potentially cure, recovery, remission. That's a moment where you have these quite defined boundaries between entering the kingdom of the sick, and then potentially coming out the other side back into the kingdom of the well. In terms of Ashworth and Palmer, there isn't necessarily the sense that they can go back to the kingdom of the well, that perhaps they've lost that citizenship once and for all, perhaps, or at least it's not in the immediate future. And so I think it's interesting to think about that a little bit more, actually. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got another question from Alessia, who says, "Thank you very much for your fantastic presentations. I did not know about some of the artists you work with. I was wondering if Marie could talk a bit more about the idea of porosity of space and time, as I find it very fascinating. I was also wondering if you relate it to the ill body of the author. Do you read the ghostliness mentioned by Ashworth as a way to move between spatio-temporal realms, both in the real world and in memory?"
Great, thank you. Great question. Yeah, I'm really glad that you picked on the porosity. I didn't get a chance to really explore this as much in the paper or even in my reading so far, really. and I want to explore this more. And porosity does seem like this really useful way of thinking about the movement between the two. And I suppose this goes back a little bit to the previous question with this idea of moving between these kingdoms, that you could move from what, one day you might be a closer to the well version of yourself. The next day it's more of the ill version of the self. Something else I really want to follow up is, I haven't read any of Ashworth's novels, but I'm increasingly wanting to. And she does seem to have this big interest in ghosts and the Gothic and ghostiness and haunting. So I think by reading those, we might also be able to get an interesting insight into the way that Ashworth is writing that. In terms of the spatiotemporal realms, both in the real world, yeah, I think there's different kind of ways of its movement. It's movement between the different times, as in when, for example, she was in the operating theatre, when she's had kind of flashbacks or memories of this. We also have these movement from different places. Her career as a writer, she's written this text over the course of about 5 years, I think, and during that time she's written other novels. She's a teacher, she's done all these other things. So she's got these different identities as well that she's kind of going back and forth with. And it's also an interesting way to think about the porosity between genres and forms as well. The fact that the novel doesn't work for her, so she turns to memoir, but it's an interesting kind of memoir. It's essay, but it's very blended. And so the form itself takes on this quite ghostly, porous, the form that's quite difficult to define. And that's perhaps what she's kind of getting at the whole time. That actually definition is really quite difficult. I hope that's answered it at least in part, but it's certainly something I want to follow up on. So thank you.
I can see that Adina's got her hand up. So Adina, would you like to come onto the camera?
Have I unmuted myself?
There we go.
Okay, good. So thank you very much for your presentation, Marie. So I have a question relating to form. It's a bit of a selfish question, as I'm working on a chapter on fragmentation. So I was wondering if you could comment further on the fragmentation and blanks which populate the text, because I feel we kind of take this fragmented form for granted when we talk about the traumatized body and self. And I was thinking if we could imagine different modes of representation when it comes to traumatized bodies and selves, and are we perhaps in a moment where we have moved from effectively driven forms to pure and simple affectation? Thank you.
Great, that's a brilliant question. Thank you. Yeah, I too have had many over years looking at different forms and different texts, and this kind of issue with the fragment. And I agree that we kind of hold it up as this, oh, it's fragmented, therefore it's trauma, and we make this very quick connection. But it always begs more questions, I think. And in terms of, from my point of view, it begs more spatial questions as well. And I think what's really interesting about Ashworth's text and Palmer's and some other ones that I've read that are published more recently is, you flick through it and it's not obviously fragmented. And it's kind of relieving to see these actual kind of finished sentences and these sort of complete images, even if those images aren't necessarily completely complete, if that makes sense. It's really refreshing to see these different modes of representation that are going on. I also wonder, in terms of illness narratives published perhaps over the sort of last 5 years, and we're seeing like a big rise in them now, the types of illnesses that are being talked about might have a bearing on this as well. That there's always going to be something that's to do with trauma, but there's different degrees to how much the trauma relates to other diagnosis, other conditions, and the varying degrees to how it's been treated and the lived experience of it. So I think we're seeing less and less of the fragment, which is not to say that the fragment isn't important. I think there's just new conversations to have and new expressions to have and to explore. But I still welcome text, like textual fragments and things like that. I'm just interested in all these new ways of actually expressing pain and trauma and suffering. So yeah, thank you. Hopefully that addressed some of what you said.
I think I have a question from Helen. So to address it, I don't know of any collaboration right now between two female artists, but there are artistic collaborations between patients and artists, patients who agree to be watched over and to be depicted in the artwork. For example, Jaxa Olsa, a British artist, has a series on gynecological cancer, and she assists during surgery. She speaks with the physicians and the surgeons, she takes sketches, and she further creates a relationship with that patient and integrate it all in her final artworks. And there are, of course, mixed approaches like hybrid bodies, 1 and 2. These were two projects in Canada in the early 20s. Which concentrated on the issue of heart transplantation. And they had a mix of male and female artists and of male and female physicians, and each of them chose a certain aspect, and some concentrated more on women pathology and some concentrated more on male pathology, especially because women's heart attacks and generally women cardiac conditions are underdiagnosed right now. They are passed over by many physicians, and this was an important subject for discussion and for artistic depiction.
Thanks very much. I think we've also got a question from Rebecca. So Rebecca, do you want to come on and ask that question?
Yeah, sorry, I was cheating. I sent Ben a private message to me. I have a question. Let me in. Anyway, sorry. So I have a question for both of you based on a really interesting quote that you used, Diana, and I think it was in the Spent section in the beginning. And there was a section from one of her cancer journals where she's writing to her nieces, I think you said.
Yes, it's from an interview she did on her work in the final years.
Yeah, because there's a really interesting phrase where you said something along the lines of she didn't want her nieces to think that this pain or like this, you know, being a patient in quite like a powerless position was only natural. And I was wondering whether you could lean into that kind of like phrase of like only natural, like in relation to like pain and suffering, the position of the patient, like gendered experiences as well. And I was wondering whether Marie potentially could look at that as well, because I think Marie mention a scene where it sounded like she Ashworth had was it like childbirth, I think, and something went wrong with the epidural, and I'm just wondering whether there could be some crossovers with this idea of like only natural, which we, you know, often hear bandied about, particularly in like female, you know, health and reproductive health.
So there are multiple factors to be weighed in. First of all, Jo Spence was from a working class family. She had a somewhat strained generational conflict relationship with her parents. Her mother had also died of cancer, I think also of breast cancer. So it was a particularly traumatic experience for her. And other than that, Spence's previous work was... sorry, there was a plane going over the myself. So Spence's previous work was very much aligned with bettering society and bettering rights for the working class. So she and her partner, Terry Dunnett, would organize photography workshops, free photography workshops. And one of her main ideas, the idea central to her praxis, was that teaching women how to operate a camera outside of their family portraits, outside of the regular pictures that women and mothers usually do, is to basically give them power, to give them social power, to give them political power, because now they can express themselves. So her cancer work relates to this previous work, even if just the first part of the decade is political and afterwards she moves into other directions. It is all geared to the position of the working class woman in British society under Margaret Thatcher and all the policies that were happening in the 1980s. She also recognizes her privilege, that she got to a point where she didn't have to work. She only worked 1 day a week, and she could spend the rest of the time reading and practicing her photography and creating this series, which undertook a lot of effort and a lot of work, especially the phototherapy series, because she would be left exhausted. It would have been a deeply emotional project, and she worked with Rosie Martin, who was a psychotherapist. And yeah, sorry if I deviated, but I think that all these factors, they all bring us back to the idea of photography as a way of empowering women, and the photography as a means of providing information that could be used in maintaining what I would say is a rightful relationship with the medical establishment, not being in a superior position to your provider of health, but in engaging in a conscious dialogue in which you are all equals.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Becky. So yeah, she has a C-section, and she makes a point of saying how they stitched it up really neatly so it won't scar. And then not long after, that's when she has a hemorrhage and it tears open. And that's the scene that I was talking about where she's lying bleeding. And then it's a thread throughout a lot of it where she's really concerned, you know, weeks, months after it happened, about her scar. She binds it. She asks her partner to keep checking that it hasn't split open. She's in pain and she's you know, scared about it. And there is a section in that chapter Ground Zero that I was talking about where she talks about going to the doctor, and she lists this sort of list of things I want to tell the doctor, and you can see bits where she crosses it out and rephrases it, which is really interesting. So she does, my tummy crossed out, abdomen hurts. And so she gives us an idea of how this interaction go, and basically the doctor says you're fine, the blood's fine, they do ultrasounds and she's fine, and basically it seems that she's dealing with this pain from inside. She feels like something inside it and it's about to sort of break out or split it open again, and he's just sort of like, well, someone should have told you to expect this. That's normal. You should have expected this pain. But it goes back to those big, you know, questions of, well, how do you know if your pain is moderate compared to someone else? This feels like incredibly intense pain. I'm worried. I feel like my body is breaking. But actually, then you go back to this, yeah, the clinical gaze, the establishment view, the institutional view, and it's, oh, that's normal. So there's that. There's also, I didn't really get a chance to touch on it in my paper, but the specificity of the female pain of this. And also in that section, Ground Zero, she, in some parts that are quite a lot of sort of cultural literary analysis, she refers to loads of different female writers. It's incredible. Some really well-known ones, Hilary Mantel, Virginia Woolf, some lesser-known ones. And one very brief quote from that, she said, some days it feels like writing truthfully about her own life is the most subversive thing a woman can do. So she really grapples with these ideas of how a woman can talk about pain, and in what way, and how much, you know, how much is allowed to be, how much you can admit that it's painful and how much you can accept that is pain, or whether just something to deal with. So yeah.
We've got another follow-on question for Marie based on Becky's. So Catherine says, is it always a male clinical gaze? I also wonder how if she tackles the normal female bleeding of menstruation compared to that extreme blood loss in the theatre.
Yeah, really interesting point. So I said he just now because that specific moment with a doctor, she does specify that it's a he, that it is a man. She doesn't actually talk about healthcare practitioners very much, from what I can remember. So she doesn't really seem to address the difference between men and women in that situation. I also can't remember if there's any mention of menstruation, but there's a lot of bits about blood, and about blood transfusions, and this idea. She has this amazing image where she talks about how she had to have so much blood infused into her that she should come with a bibliography of names of people's blood it was. And I find that quite amazing, and also this way that she turns herself into a book or a manuscript of some kind, which also has links with some phrases, some writing of Hilary Mantel as well. But yeah, I don't think there's any menstruation in that, but it would be interesting to go back and see if that does pop up at any point. Thank you.
We have another question from Alessia. She says, I have another quick question, this time for Diana. Do you think that artistic media used, such as photography and graffiti, which are based on immediacy and are also very connected to political activism, have an impact on the way the power structures that characterize the medical establishment can be subverted?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because, for example, in the case of the Wuhan graffiti, the images that I have is of graffiti which is positive and praising of the actions which are undertook. But at the same time, there are other images, there are other works created of graffiti which is questioning the whole central authority, which is questioning what the medical system is undergoing. There has been graffiti around the world written on hospital walls denouncing the treatment of, let's say, the homeless. So yeah, it really has a direct and immediate impact.
Thank you very much. I think if it's some, is there another question? No, I do also have another question if, while we're waiting to see if anyone else has a question. This is for Marie. You were talking about the reader's decision when you were talking about the Russian dolls that were next to each other, and you were kind of saying it's the reader's decision to either kind of I don't know, try to put these narratives together and to kind of patch it back up, or to kind of hold open what you were describing or what you quoted as a collusion or a mixture of identities and this kind of thing. And I was just wondering, like, in your experience, what is usually the reader's desire to do here? Like, do you ever find that the reader has a kind of clinical gaze in which the reader wants to kind of, I don't know, be therapeutic towards the text and put it back together? Or is there also a kind of way in which the reader is trying to hold open these collusions and has a bit more of a kind of, I don't know, subversive relation to it, I guess?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. When I first read it, and I wasn't aware of this structure when I was just, I hadn't flipped through it in advance. I was just turning page as I went along. And I don't know if I necessarily found it in the first bit where it suddenly stops. But there was one bit where I suddenly was like, hang on, have I got a dodgy copy here? Like, I think I need to, and I did a little annotation of like, is there something missing here? And then quickly realized that was intentional. And I read it page by page by page. And what the effect is that you have forgotten what the first part said afterwards. But each of the sections really speak to one another, but they're not entirely about the same thing. So the first sort of two sections really talk about Chernobyl. She talks about her experience when she was young and some children came over and stayed in the community, and this sort of experience. And then she sort of changes tack, and she talks about a kind of a magician from who kind of invented the sort of cutting women in half trick, and the kind of really interesting sort of insights into that. And then you also get these literary things as well, and you can understand all of it on one level. I think you're not confused as a reader necessarily. When I came to reread it in order to give this paper, I decided to actually read it in a way that I flipped back and forth, and I got the whole. So I do want, and I think maybe there is benefit for the fact that I've read it both those ways now. But I would be really interested to know what other people have done to read it. Although I imagine most people aren't aware that it has this structure until they're sort of partway through, which is how I first experienced it. But I was really fascinated straight away by this idea of movement, because I started doing it and then I realized and thought, oh, hang on, should I change my body in relation to this? Should I flip back and forth? And as a kind of side note, I wonder how someone would read it in a non-physical form, in an electronic form, which I haven't done. Mine's a physical copy. And I think that would be a really interesting thing to sort of explore, see how generally people have read it, whether they've been warned to read it in a certain way, or they just come at it and just, keep going with it.
That's fascinating. Thanks so much. I hadn't even thought about it being a digital copy as well as as well. I think we'll have to, because of time, we'll have to finish on these last two questions. So from Fiona, Fiona says, the clinical gaze is almost always talked about in the singular as something monolithic and one-dimensional. Have either of you come across examples of a multiplicity of clinical gazes existing within a single text or set of artworks? Is the clinical gaze always singular for Ashworth and Spence, or is there evidence that they might experience a variety of different clinical gazes?
So I do not consider it monolithical, and I think it may encompass variety of gazes. But at the moment, I can't pinpoint it on Spence's work. If I would have to make an example, I think I would make the collaboration, basically the collaborative practice between Norbert Kalner, the British surgeon who is also a portrait painter, and Bellani, and the way in which whilst maintaining his surgical view, Kalner managed to reforge his artistic view after his meeting of Bellani, and afterwards he asserted that it influenced his own medical view and his own way of interacting with the patient. So whilst it was not a complete reconstruction of his own medical gaze, and I think that would have been impossible in the first place, it did provide a shift which otherwise is very rarely heard of.
That's such a great question, Fiona. Thank you. I can't think of a specific example from Ashworth, but thinking more broadly from other things that I've read and previous times I've thought about this, I don't think there is a suggestion of a kind of singular clinical gaze. I mean, one way of interpreting it is in terms of thinking of what kind of clinical. Is it doctor? Is it nurse? Is it physiotherapist? So with Palmer's text, there are sort of little images of her in a more of a traditional clinical setting, interacting with a doctor, but also so much of her text is about this sort of hydrotherapy and interacting with other women, mainly in this Budapest thermal baths, and their experiences of why they're at the baths for various different reasons. Some of them come back and forth. And I think there is an element, even if it's not explicit in that text, certainly other texts can be read in this way, is actually thinking about the kind of clinical gazes you can get from patients, especially into patients with chronic conditions, who kind of you might kind of almost ingest that perspective, and it might impact how you then interact with other people with that same disease, other patients, patient communities, service users, and I think that would be a really interesting route to look at as well. I can't think of any more specific examples, but I'm also thinking about X-rays and the fact that the cover of Ashworth's book, I don't know if I can just show you, is an X-ray. And there is also a bit where she is talking about these sort of sections on Chernobyl. Her partner is looking at X-rays at the time in preparation for an exam. So you've got all these conversations around radioactivity, radium, mercury, X-rays. And so you've got this really literal moment of a gaze but it's also put into a different context because they're lying in bed. She's reading about Chernobyl on her laptop. He's looking through images of X-rays that aren't tied to a specific patient. They are just, they're more in a teaching capacity. So I think there's different levels that you can look at it from, which is my very rambled answer, sorry.
Marie, just a really, really quick question. Do you know if the author was involved in choosing the X-ray?
I have no idea. I don't think. Sorry, I'm just trying to go back to no, I don't know actually. That would be interesting to explore.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to both of you. I think we're going to have to wrap up there because of the time. But kind of like as we've said before, like normally with these kind of talks, if we were, this was all kind of like in a physical space, we'd continue these talks afterwards, etc. So please, like, feel free to email in and engage on Twitter with either the speakers today or any of the speakers in the series and me and Becky. And it would be there's so many more questions I imagine that people haven't got to ask, and there's so much more I want to ask as well. So definitely let's keep these conversations going, because that was absolutely brilliant. Thanks so much to both of you. Cool. So Becky, do you want to introduce next week?
Yes. Yeah. So I've just following on what Ben said, I just popped our email in the chat there. So if you ever have any questions to the speakers, you can always email us, and we can be in, a go-between, and Twitter as well, obviously. So our next seminar will be, so this is number 3, it'll be on the 20th of October. So 2 weeks from today, same time. And the theme is death and mourning, and we'll have 3 speakers, Jordan McCullough, Tamara Norwood, and Christina Robu, and they're all talking about these themes of death and mourning. 2 papers on deceased children, and then another paper on mourning the living. So it will be a really interesting seminar, and I'm just going to pop again in the chat the link to registering. So the Zoom is like recurring meetings, so it's the same for the seminars, but it's good just to register via these links every time, just so we get an idea of numbers. I think that's it. So thank you again to Diana and Marie for coming along tonight or this afternoon to give your papers, and they were really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for your questions and discussion.